This is the kind of kickoff event for what's going to be a weekend of socialist education at a time when the movement is quite strong in the United States and elsewhere. We've got a really exciting slate of books that we're going to talk about here tonight. The Jacobin series has published around a half dozen books with Verso since the series kind of first launched in 2013 and 2014, and it's kind of grown alongside the magazine. And we have a really impressive and exciting slate of books this year, 5 in all, that we're going to be launching. Maybe 6, depending on the kind of mortality of a key figure in U.S. empire. And the books so far have only been out for a short couple of weeks, and they've already proven to be really successful with activists, success in the kind of bourgeois press, not only kind of outlining important perspectives and strategic lessons from class struggle happening in the United States today, but also kind of outlining a vision for what socialism might mean and what it has to offer as opposed to capitalism. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Bhaskar, and we'll get started with the event.
Oh. All right, well, thank you all for coming. Mike and I just got off a plane from Chicago, and I had very little sleep, but I just drank a cup of coffee for the 6th time in my life. So I imagine I'm going to be very spastic in like 30 minutes. But we have a great slate of books. I mean, the point of Jacobin books when it originated was that Jacobin at the time had maybe 4,000 subscribers. We were reaching a very niche audience. Now Jacobin has over 30,000 subscribers. Our circulation is like 40 to 45,000. But what Verso gave us originally was this platform to actually be a venue where you could find a piece of Jacobin merchandise in a bookstore in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And at least when I was getting politicized, that's what I would do. I would go to bookstores. I would look for the Verso or the Haymarket or the other left presses or AK Press or whatever else. I was a syndicalist for like 3 months when I was 14. I was really excited about what happened in Spain in the 1930s because I was a very slow reader. So I was just like, well, this must have ended very well. Little did I know. So it gave us this wider platform, and it was been on hiatus for a little bit. Some of the books did very well, like I think Peter Fraser's 4 Futures sold 20-something thousand copies, and that's only the ones that Verso told us about. So maybe there were more. But, so there's a new wave of book out, and the format of this panel is going to be a little bit different. I hate left-wing events. I hate panels. They're boring. They last forever. There's lots of unnecessary kind of introductions. So the format is going to be, I'm going to ask all the authors basic questions each in turn for around 6-7 minutes. They're going to respond, and the event is going to be over in about 40 minutes. So it's my main law. It's a Michael Bay theory of politics. It's like no good thing should be longer than the runtime of Men in Black 2. Okay.
That was 40 minutes?
No, it was like 92 minutes or something. But. So I guess we'll start with a very interesting book that's been a long time coming, which is The People's Republic of Walmart. When we were creating this book, there was a little bit of a debate about whether to call it The People's Republic of Walmart or The People's Republic of Amazon. We came to the conclusion that Walmart was a much bigger and more relevant company than Amazon. And of course, this book was released in February, so we were vindicated. But the book is co-written by Leigh Phillips, by Michal Rozworski. I butchered your last name there, but I got it right before.
Yes.
So the thought that counts. And it lays out an argument that I thought was initially going to be a defense of planning in the context of all these debates that socialists have had between are we market socialists? Do we believe in economic planning? Where do we draw the line? We thought it was going to be an intervention like that. It turned out that the book was much broader and much better than all of us expected. And I guess, well...
Thank you.
I actually read it after publication, so I was relieved because, it's easier than pulping the books. But But it was, it came out really well. But it seemed to me primarily a book not about markets versus planning, and I do come down on the market side of that debate, but about the idea that human beings can consciously direct our resources and our efforts, and can democratically participate in society. So it was almost like a defense of rationality, a defense of the Enlightenment, a defense of many things. So I'm wondering whether you could expound on the core thesis of your book, or what you were trying to accomplish when you were writing it.
Sure. Through the magic of low expectations, not much, but good things came out of it. I think you're right. I think when we sort of sat down to write it and talked about it, really was to be a defense of an idea rather than a thesis, and basically just that idea of democratic planning, right, of rationally deciding about production and distribution rather than letting the free market and market relations dictate both. I think concretely it's a defense of sort of twin ideas. One, that human beings already plan economic life all the time, and that's where the case studies about Walmart, Amazon, the National Health Service, all of that sort of comes in. What we thought was the necessary idea to go along with that is that we could do so much better. We could do so democratically, freeing ourselves and allowing so many, currently suppressed capacities to flourish. And I don't think I'll spoil anything if I read out literally the last line of the book. Sorry, everyone. Planning works, just not yet for us. And that's really the central point of the book, and a way of sort of excavating an old debate, not so much, not just about very particular institutions, but about how we can organize sort of social life, and that we could do so together.
I guess sort of the elevator pitch would be that, we have to probably concede that the right argument in what's come to be called the economic calculation debate, or economic calculation problem, or the socialist calculation debate initially in the 1920s, that we wanted to sort of revive, or return to and have a revival of that conversation. So sort of primer on that. We have to recognize that the conservative argument within that debate is probably the strongest argument that's ever been made against the conception of socialism. It's really good. It is that, if the sheer infinitude of variables along the supply chain is so vast that it would have to be, if that was going to be replaced by human beings, you would have to have an army of bureaucrats to replace the price signal, this very, very simple mechanism instead. And that would inevitably result in, a bureaucratization, it would never be able to fully capture the all the aspects, all the variables along that supply chain. This would inevitably result in shortages, that would result in chaos, that chaos in turn would result in authoritarianism. Bada bing, bada boom, you have the Soviet Union. It's a very, very, very good argument. However, if the argument that planning at scale doesn't work, it's fine if you organize a few things amongst your friends on a camping trip, but anything beyond some small number of variables, and inevitably you have this chaos. If that's true, then Walmart shouldn't work. Because Walmart, while it exists within the market, internally it's entirely planned. And it's now an economy in terms of its revenues, it's on the scale of a Sweden or Switzerland. It's this is the largest private enterprise in the world. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to dig in and look at the logistical wonder, the incredible thing that Amazon is, from that perspective, and tease out what makes it work and whether that's, and other examples of that.
So there's two ends to the debate about markets and about planning, which is the calculation issue of can we take all these variables and replicate it, and also even connect to that kind of the moral issue of what is it we object to in markets, right? Is it, we object to obviously all socialists object to market dependence, but do we object to the existence of markets? But then there's the other question that gets addressed less, which is the question of incentives. Is that something you think is still a relevant issue? Like, do we have to, in other words, isn't firm failure at times a good thing? Obviously, we don't want the price of failure to be destitution, but in some conditions, wouldn't firm failure weed out inefficient and exploitative labor techniques and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should separate those two things. Exploitative labor techniques, inefficient production, irrational production, all these things are things that probably if we were, collectively deciding over our social goals, we wouldn't want. But I think, and we make this argument in the book, that it's kind of a poverty of imagination to think that the market and the incentives that it creates, incentive for private gain, is the only means that we have to sort of, collectively move towards collective goals based, towards social goals. We cite in the book Elinor Ostrom, who is the only woman to have won the sort of fake Nobel Prize for economics, the Swedish prize, and her big idea was basically a debunking of this tragedy of the commons, which is often brought up in a similar context, right? That when you have something that's owned or managed collectively, eventually, the market fundamentals will say very quickly, it'll basically collapse, right? Like people, if it's a pasture, within 2 years there'll be fallow and no one will won't be able to use it. And she basically went back and said, how did this look like in history? And she found lots of different kind of institutional arrangements, some of them also potentially not great, like ostracizing people out of the village or whatever. But the point is that there's a broad range of ways that humans can incentivize, or in other words, like more broadly, just kind of collectively decide how we're going to accomplish social goals. And I don't think we need to resign ourselves to the thought that this one way that we're using now that involves all this exploitation, destitution, failure, irrationality of production is the only way.
Right. Are you hopeful right now in terms of a return to, even among the liberal left, there seems to be at least the belief that the commanding heights of the economy, the government can do good things, like a majority of self-described liberals and close to a majority of self-described conservatives now believe that the government should in fact plan and organize our health insurance in this country. Yeah. Are things pushing in the right direction? I guess, first of all, we're going to go over a little bit of time, but I normally ask these personal interest questions, like how did you two meet and so on, how did you decide to write this book? But a condensed version of that is also, in your experience on the left of many, many years, is this a better period when it comes to this particular issue than maybe it was in the late 90s or in the 2000s when a lot of us were getting politicized? Yeah,
I think that thanks. I think one of the reasons our book has had a really nice impact is that for a long time, now, and rightfully so, since the economic crisis of about 2008, there's been an absolute necessity for us to be critiquing the existing society. But there's a lack of an answer as to, well, what would socialism look like? What would it be, a concrete thing? And I think that I think it's a great time to be talking about, well, really concretely, what would socialism look like? And what is the problem with planning and markets?
All right. Well, thank you very much. The book is really well written. It's a breezy read. You should pick up a copy. Apparently that was all Leigh's efforts, but they're both great writers. And next up is Jenny Brown, and Jenny's book is still in production. I think you just got the corrected proofs, or you're just correcting the proofs now. It'll be out in October. And Without Apology is an intervention defending abortion rights. And I think this is especially important now because it seems like this is one issue where it's a battle we thought we won, right? It's a battle that was won in the Eastern Bloc countries. It was won in most democratic capitalist countries, with a few exceptions, a few Catholic states in which the rights came later, or in the case of Ireland and a few other places only being granted now. But it seems like this victory that we forgot about, the struggle that was over, is now really relevant because it's been rolled back. And I guess, where do you attribute the fact that even as this new generation seems to be more disposed to left of center ideas, there's a rolling back of support for reproductive rights and access and other basic things?
Well, I argue in the book that that the period when we won abortion rights was a period when the birth rate was quite high, and even the Republican Party, one section of the Republican Party was fairly supportive of abortion rights. But the period that we're looking at now, our birth rate is the lowest it's ever been. And so I argue that while it wasn't a big concern, and in fact overpopulation was a big concern in the late 60s and early 70s, right now we're seeing a lot of signs that the ruling class is very worried about the population, in particular the white population, but also the population of everybody, because of course they're very keen on immigrants. They just don't want immigrants to have rights. As you can see, while Trump is, trying to barricade the border, he's also increasing the number of guest workers. So it's very much about the labor of women doing this work cheaply, and you can see the contrast between Europe, where in response to low birth rates, and it's very clear and openly discussed that the birth rates are low. They have instituted things like, a year of paid leave, fully subsidized childcare. Of course, they already have national health care systems, lots of vacation on your job, whereas the response to the low birth rate here has been very much to make it harder to get abortion and birth control. So I think that's really why we're facing that right now.
Now, when it comes to, let's say, what role has the liberal left that still supports these rights played in the backsliding? So the most striking thing for me after Trump's election was Planned Parenthood, which was in danger of getting defunded, spent a lot of money on a series of TV ads and other marketing blitz. And the premise of these ads were all women going to Planned Parenthood, getting counseling through Planned Parenthood, and over the course of these discussions coming to the conclusion that they, in fact, wanted to keep their kid, which, of course, is a right that we fight for. It's a reasonable thing, but in the political context, is clearly signaling something to someone, and it seemed to be part of this backsliding that you saw in the rhetoric of politicians like Clinton or whatnot. Was there a point when liberals were more forthright in their defense of reproductive rights? Is this a serious shift, or were they always this bad?
Well, the short answer there is no. The original post-war abortion rights movement, which was made up of professionals, lawyers, doctors, and whatnot, their strategy was to try to get exceptions to the abortion law. So rape, incest, life of the mother exceptions. And they were able to get those exceptions in a lot of states. The problem was that didn't help ordinary women. Anybody who was pregnant and didn't want to be was still forced into the underground. So it wasn't until the women's liberation movement made a demand for free abortion on demand that it became a popular issue, and suddenly there was a mass movement. So I think what we've seen for Planned Parenthood, which is continually on the defensive for reasons that we all know, what we've seen is that they have sort of fallen back to the liberal position, which is, oh, well, can we just have it in these few cases? Look at all these extreme cases. And that is really not appealing to women who don't necessarily need an abortion because they're about to die. They need an abortion because they got pregnant and don't want to be. So very much, I think we've gone back to that. So I make a case in the book for us to get back to the original women's liberation demands and be unapologetic about how important this is for women's liberty.
It's a great argument that's been expressed in a few Jacobin pieces that Jenny has written. You have a new book out. I think you should plug the new book for the people watching on the live stream.
Yeah, I have a book that just came out in March called Birth Strike, The Hidden Fight Over Women's Work, and I make a lot of the arguments in there about the birth rate, but also about what it will take in terms of a feminist fight to win the things that we need to have children in a decent and humane society.
But you should also buy the Verso book that's coming out in October, because it's kind of like, I don't know how many of you are fans of Lil Wayne, but it's like you're listening to the mixtapes, it's like 2007, you're listening to The Drought, but you have to buy the Carter because The Drought, it's not as good, but it's also good, so purchase both. Anyway. I have a niche audience, a very niche audience, but now I guess next up is Sam Stein, whose book is already out, and Sam is also a contributor to Jacobin, a bunch of other venues, and his book was a long time coming. It's called Capital City. It's broadly talking about planning and about a lot of the ways we think about our city. Though I think initially some of the discussions we had about the book was going to be more focused on New York, because New York is really the hotbed of a lot of these debates about planning. And Sam uses planning in the way that a leftist would use the word planning. Now, planning is used a lot in housing discussions, but planning is actually, people are discussing zoning as kind of the only way to plan. So I guess this is maybe too broad of a question, but how do we come to the point when zoning was conflating with all sorts of planning, and when our only mechanism to shape housing and the way our cities are constructed and obviously the environment in which all of us live our lives just became zoning?
Yeah, that's a great question. Could answer that all night, but let me think of a short version. So what zoning is the rules that cities make for what can be built where, in terms of different kinds of uses and different kinds of sizes of buildings. So if you think about it that way, it's really a market solution. It's still the city making a plan, but the plan is to tell the market what they can do. It's a parameter, it's not really a plan. And so you see that zoning initially is used in the beginning of the 20th century, late 19th century in California, as an explicitly racist tool of segregating cities. Over time, it becomes still racist, but using the logic of land value instead of using the logic of race explicitly, as Hillary Wilson has written about, who's in the audience. The result is exactly the same. So what we've seen is cities using zoning as a tool to do everything else. It's the thing that they have control over. As the federal government has limited their actions around public housing, as a lot of states have limited their actions around rent control, land use and zoning becomes the last tool they've got, and they use it for everything. For promotion of affordable housing, for environment, whatever, and none of it works very well. But they stick to it and they keep redoing it over and over again because the real estate market likes it a lot. And we're living in a moment when a majority of the world's capital is invested in real estate. So real estate really over-determines what happens in cities. They're very comfortable with zoning as the way that planning goes through because they retain a huge amount of power.
So what the way these debates are often polarized in New York City is, it seems like either you could be on the side of middle-class community groups that, or actually homeowner associations, I shouldn't say community groups, that are fighting for the maintenance of low density, kind of the existing housing stock and the existing situation. Or on the other hand, you could be on the side of big, aggressive developers. And the logic of, I guess they wouldn't call themselves social democrats because it's the United States and we don't use that language. The language of kind of right-wing social democrats, or whatever the de Blasio equivalent, would be in a different country, is that, it's better to allow the developers to create new value, then we could tax and redistribute some of that value, or we could make sure a fifth of the homes are affordable, and, if anything, the effect of creating more supply would be a downward pressure. And obviously, as leftists, we try to fight for a third alternative, but is this the way you see a lot of this debate being played out in the popular press? And, is there a reason why in places like California or whatnot, it seems like working class people can sometimes side with the developers, at least support politicians unreservedly who do?
Interesting. So first, in New York, I don't think we have a large vocal constituent of protective homeowners. I think they're very effective much more quietly. And they get what they need, largely because their city council member doesn't demand anything in terms of development. Whereas in the poorer areas of the city, if the council members want anything for their neighborhood, the way that they're going to get it is through a rezoning that allows real estate to do more in their area, and in exchange for that, they might get the park and the school that they've been demanding for years. Meanwhile, the white homeowner neighborhood already has that park and that school. So the system kind of hides the first side that you were talking about that I think we see more explicitly in other cities. In terms of a dynamic, in addition to those two, I think there's a huge anti-gentrification movement that's coming out of tenant neighborhoods, not homeowner neighborhoods. We've seen tenant unions forming, we've seen community-based plans drawn up, and a real rejection of the de Blasio logic that what we need to do is build more luxury housing in the areas where land values are low, i.e. working class neighborhoods, and then take something back in the form of affordable housing. And at first, I think the critique was, well, that's not enough affordable housing, or it's not affordable enough. And at some point, we made the transition into, no, all this luxury housing is going to displace us. Even if that affordable stuff was affordable, we can't just be adding high-cost supply. It's going to screw up our neighborhoods. So the YIMBY argument has not really worked in New York, which I'm very proud of, but they're certainly trying.
And I guess, is there immediate measures that we could take to, let's say, deal with investment properties? Let's say banning, like, second homes for people who aren't U.S. nationals. I know that sounds dangerously nationalist, but in other countries, measures like that have been proposed, I think Norway or elsewhere.
Yeah, I wouldn't go with the U.S. nationals part, but yeah, we could be taxing severely all these investor properties so that that wasn't actually a good investment anymore. We could be expanding rent regulation in the way that a lot of groups are working on right now. We could be taking back investor properties, and we're talking about nationalizing the largest investor in Berlin right now. We should all be paying close attention to that. There's a ton of things we could do, and towards the end of the book, I lay out a lot of things that are totally kosher in the system right now, mostly to show that this is not what's happening. Like it's very possible to act differently even within a capitalist democracy, and yet they're not, and that's why we can't expect the mechanisms we have right now to self-correct.
I guess the last thing I'll ask is, there is a way, as socialists we would say that there's probably a limit to rent controls you could establish, because at some point if you're going to say the private market is going to construct all this new housing, but we're going to make it very difficult to make a profit off of constructing new housing, then it's going to cause an issue at some point or the other. But we do have a solution, which is the creation of high quality, luxurious, even public housing. But that's not even on the agenda. And for the longest time, in New York at least, I've always been happy that we were in a city in which it wasn't politically popular to say you're going to bulldoze and demolish existing public housing stock, but it's certainly not popular to build it, especially dense public housing stock. And how do we deal with that debate, especially when the actual real base for our politics, the people who would vote for the politicians affiliated with the left or whatnot, aren't demanding either or, whereas maybe in other cities at certain points they were demanding or supportive of destruction. But how do we put public housing back on the agenda?
Right. The American left first has to get comfortable with public housing again. That was a demand of the American left for a very long time, and then the way that it was implemented was so bad that now a lot of Americans, for good reason, don't want to be associated with the history of public housing in the US. I think the answer is taking control of private buildings. It's not about necessarily creating whole new luxury cities of public housing. We actually have very nice city right here. There's a lot of landlords that aren't doing their jobs. We could be taking their property. Even de Blasio says that he's going to do this. He's been saying it for like 5 years now, and he just won't do it. We have the mechanisms to do that. The first public housing in New York City was not new construction. It was taking over from shitty tenement landlords that had built a nice building and then didn't keep it up. So I think that's a way that people could actually get on board with that would be qualitatively different than the past history of public housing in the US.
Well, de Blasio thinks he's going to be president, so maybe when he's president, he'll be able to do it. But last, maybe least, but probably not, Eric Blanc, my good friend. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I like Eric. It's fine. It's a joke. Eric just wrote a book that's coming out April 23rd, which is called Red State Revolt, and he had his kickoff launch at the People's Forum last week. And Eric is a former educator. He was a teacher in the Bay Area, a longtime leftist, and he was on the ground in a very interesting way in West Virginia and Oklahoma and a lot of these other places, and he's been there as a real participant. And as a result, he's been able to not only analyze things from kind of the broader view as a Marxist who thinks in terms of epochs and continents as Marxists are wont to do, but also as someone who was talking to these teachers when they were formulating their strategies, when they were kicking off this really inspiring strike wave. So the result is, I think, a book that socialists should aspire to repeat, which is neither a work of theory nor a work of journalism, but kind of weaves the two together in a really accessible way. So it was very exciting to see.
You say something nice now, I say. You had to pivot back to something nice.
Well, I talk my way in and out of trouble. But, I do think that, it really was inspiring. But I guess to ask the devil's advocate question, it is, to what extent can we call what's been going on a strike wave? And to what extent are we certain that it'll, continue? Because obviously, it's been massive by the standards of the U.S., but we're in a country and an environment where we haven't been exposed to mass strike activities. Whereas, a few 100,000 teachers marching the street might be like an average Saturday in France. You know what I mean? So I guess drawing on your more, not necessarily cynical, but your broader perspective, how should we situate what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, it is a strike wave, and the numbers just came out from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, because there's actually some debate and some not amazing Jacobin articles about sort of poo-pooing actually the extent to which there was a strike wave or not. And yeah, this is the largest number of workers on strike since 1986. That's over 3 decades. So that's significant. It's very politically significant because it's not just the number of workers, but that these were actually the largest, on average, strikes in the history of the United States. So the political impact is outsized compared to just the number of workers, because the impact that they've had within the states that they erupted has been really significant as far as the gains that were won, and also just the kind of inspiration that it created across the country for people watching. It captured people's imagination more, I think, than a lot of smaller strikes, maybe even a similar number of workers might have had. And whether the question of whether it'll continue, who knows? I mean, it's impossible to say the extent to which it will continue. But, I mean, just today, Sacramento went out on strike. The Stop and Shop workers, 31,000, went out on strike in the private sector. So all indications are that it's not slowing down. Even when West Virginia popped off, a lot of people said, oh, it's just there's something in the water, they've got red bandanas. It's very, people, new mine workers. So there's something like romanticized about it. But then it's continued to spread. It spread to the blue states, just happened in Los Angeles. So there's no indication now that that dynamic is stopping. And then how far it goes remains to be seen.
How do we understand the role of the trade union bureaucracy in these strikes? So I don't mean to use the word bureaucracy even necessarily pejorative, but let's say a good strike like the CWA, like the Verizon workers strike in New York. That was a strike that was very similar to the strikes we had in the 60s and 70s, which is, trade union leaders calling for a strike because they see that it's a useful bargaining tactic in order to get a better contract for their workers, which is, a tactic that, we now think of striking as a radical act, but in fact, it was an act that was done all the time by the Ruthers and all the other trade union leaders in the 60s and 70s. But it seems like in this wave of teacher strikes, especially in West Virginia and particularly in West Virginia, that pushing for these strikes and the radicalization of it, or even in Chicago, when Karen Lewis was ready to sign an agreement potentially, or negotiate an agreement, but the teacher said no, and they kind of pushed her into a more radical position, that it was really driven by the rank and file. Is that true of Oklahoma, of Los Angeles, of these other strikes too? Is there a difference? How should we kind of understand the particular role of the trade union bureaucracies or the leaderships, I guess, in these different contexts?
Yeah, so maybe the important thing to say from the outset is the legal context really matters a lot, and it's so the strikes look really different in different parts of the country. Part of the things that's so exciting about West Virginia and Oklahoma and Arizona, these were illegal statewide strikes. And so that's actually not because they were red states or even right-to-work states. The vast majority of states in the United States, public sector strikes are illegal. So that's the norm. It's illegal if you're a public sector worker strike in New York, as some of our comrades from CUNY can talk about. And so what the political significance of that is meant that they broke the law in a way that actually posed a new perspective for labor as a whole. But in regards to your question, it also meant that the union leadership was extremely reluctant in these states to do anything like even talk about a strike. So they had to get pushed from below. In Arizona, Oklahoma, and West Virginia, it was very much this kind of tumultuous, Facebook-driven, messy upsurge. It looks really different though in a place like LA, which there was a rank and file caucus. So I think you can just separate out then the blue states, quote unquote, in which strikes are legal, in which the unions have collective bargaining. And in those contexts, you see the Chicago model or the LA model in which radicals for years had to sort of build up a caucus and take over their union leadership. And so, yeah, in LA, the leadership was led by radicals, and the same way it was led by radicals in Chicago. So they were able to use the existing union apparatus to build a similar type of militancy. So I think the paths are going to differ based on context. It's a little hard to generalize.
So to end on a broader point, I'm wondering whether you could, in a nutshell, explain the left's orientation towards unions, because I feel like we just dove in a bit towards certain criticism in the abstract of union leaderships or whatnot, but what do we mean when we say we want rank and file democracy? How do we relate to existing unions? I don't know if you could explain kind of the rank and file strategy in a minute.
No. So the short version is, like, the working class as a whole has power because it's the majority, and because by not working we can create crises, whether that's by economic cutting off profits or by creating a social crisis in the public sector. And so that power is not normally tapped because people are scared, and if you don't have organization at your work, you're basically at the whims of your boss in almost like dictatorial fashion. So the union is the one way that in the space that we are exploited, in which we spend so much of our time, we can push back. And so part of the reason why the left is so weak in the United States and really across the world is that unions have been decimated. So the argument, therefore, is if we're going to rebuild class power as a whole, it's very hard to do that without a strong union movement. And I'll just end with this, is that it's a very exciting moment because not just the strike wave, but you have the confluence of maybe two other factors. One is the growth of the socialist movement, so things like DSA. One of the reasons that you have the strike wave is that you had socialists, the people that initiated the strike in West Virginia were socialists, and so there's a whole new layer of young people in particular who are looking for political alternatives, and so that layer can sort of help revive the labor movement. And then the second thing, just to end on, is Bernie. Like the opening we have because of Bernie for pushing class politics and reviving the union movement means that the question of like generalizing the strike wave is possible in a way it mightn't otherwise be, because of the political expectations being raised so high and the possibility of people feeling like there's somebody in power that will have their back, because right now people are too scared to fight back. So, to end on sort of a rah-rah, hopeful note.
I have one more follow-up here.
Oh, okay.
But I should do a plug that Jenny was the editor, or one of the editors of Labor Notes, which is still a publication that is probably the most important advocate of this vision of.
I'm also the co-author of a book about the Chicago teachers. So.
Yeah, but I guess the last question is, the way you described that, you talked about the strategic positions of workers, right? And obviously this is a key point where Marxists don't think about the working class because they're oppressed, because they're weak, because quite the contrary, it's because they're so strategic positioned in the economy, because they're in fact powerful and they have latent power. Now, traditionally our focus when we're thinking about strategic nodes in the economy has been on the private sector. It's been, here are the workers that can disrupt capital the most. Here are the longshore workers that if you just convince and you politicize 1,000, 2,000 of them, you could create a cascading effect that could impact the whole economy. And we would find the most profitable firms, or the firms where we thought you'd have the most bargaining power, or the firms with the fewest number of organized workers have the most impact. And we put that at the center of our coalition. So the French Communist Party's social base was the industrial proletariat. Over time, the French Socialist Party, the center-left space, were postal workers and teachers and people in the medical profession and whatnot, white-collar workers. How should we think about the shift now, where when we talk about the strategic part of the working class right now, in Jacobin and other venues, we're more often than not talking about teachers and nurses, whereas before we would talk about workers in the private sector. So I don't even mean it as far as the nature of these professions, I just mean private versus public sector.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question, because internationally, the phenomenon that we're seeing in the United States is the norm. So like Poland, right now there's an indefinite strike of teachers. So the norm in most places is actually that the public sector is at the fore of labor militancy, and often in industries that are primarily led by women. So that's a significant fact. The question then is, that I don't think we have an answer to, and we're going to have to try it out in practice, is can the public sector be sort of the pivot through which you could have a revived labor movement as a whole, right? Through which you could have the spread of labor militancy to the private sector. There's some indications very weakly that you see some of that in the United States. So, for instance, like the shop and stop workers today, but just more generally beyond teachers, because of the labor market being tight, there's possibilities for expansion to the private sector. I think the big question, though, is, like, in the political context in which we're in, I think that actually it's probably going to take a significant amount of political intervention to create the space for the private sector to fight back, because people are so terrified, and there's a real danger of people's jobs, being lost. So I think one of the exciting things about maybe the Green New Deal, for instance, is if you could imagine these are jobs that aren't going to be easily moved because of the nature of renewable energy. You could see a revived private sector labor movement, or public sector, depending on how that plays out, and that being a pivot through which you could see the expansion of labor beyond teaching and healthcare. But that's going to require intervention of the state. And I'm actually a little bit skeptical about the possibility of just teaching spreading to the private sector just by inspiration in the short term.
Or also potentially, even though it's not our model, it's not what we would do in the ideal world, us having to use these electoral breakthroughs to try to stimulate private sector actions. So the Verizon strike was timed to Sanders campaigning in 2016 in New York. And a lot of this planning or whatnot. So we could kind of use the fact that people are engaging with politics primarily through voting for people, but then bring it to deeper. It
always comes back to Bernie.
Yeah, I was using lots of euphemisms, but it is what it is. So all these books are either out or coming out very soon, and they really, I think, are a tremendous contribution to Marxist and socialist political thought, because they're comprehensible, they're accessible, and they will far outlive all of us, as far as we know. I really do think this is kind of the purpose of all these people's works, and spending so much time producing this work and engaging with these ideas, is that all these authors were advocating for and developing this thought and speaking in small groups of leftists when these ideas were extremely unpopular. And now these ideas are fairly unpopular. And it really does matter, because if you're a socialist today and you're 17, 18 years old and you're coming to these ideas, you actually have clear, comprehensible guides to engaging in these debates and contributing to them. And that wasn't really the case before. It was kind of like, assembling, a toy without a manual before. It's still going to require work. There's still effort involved now, but now there's a real manual out there for you to, follow along with. And these books, I think, are a wonderful contribution. Verso Books makes it all possible. They know how to produce books. We really don't. We produce a very good magazine that you should subscribe to. But thanks to Emily, Wes, Ben, Jake, everyone else at Verso for their contributions. But thanks.